If you've had any cryptid encounters that you'd like me to share on here, email me at jttosstories@gmail.com. Story 1. So, a little background, as it's been years since this encounter. I'm now a 28-year-old male residing in Georgia, but at the time of this story, I was 13 and living in South Mississippi where this took place. So many years ago, my parents had gotten divorced. When my family split, my dad moved in with my grandmother, along with my younger brother in Mississippi. My mom had moved across the state lines to Alabama. No more than 40 miles apart, I decided to move in with my mom, but I visited my dad every weekend because they had agreed upon joint custody. Now, where my dad and my grandma lived, that road had a lot of relatives of ours living down the road. Now, from the beginning of the road to the end is probably about 15 or 20 miles, but our relatives lived starting with us at the beginning, and the last relative that would be furthest down the road lived about 2 miles deep. Pretty much the first 2 miles of this road, I knew it and had family on either side. So riding bikes or walking was very common for us kids at this time. Also, not much to worry about, like getting abducted, because my relatives were on either side. My last relative of this 2 mile stretch was by far my favorite to visit at this part of my life. My aunt and uncle lived there with my cousin, who was only 3 years older than me. My cousin and I were very close. I mean, so close. Every time I'd visit my dad, I'd get there, visit for about 30 minutes, and then walk or ride my bike to my cousin's for the duration of the weekend. I adored him, as well as my aunt and uncle. We were big into Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, World Online. I mean, anything that was popping in the early 2000s, we had a slice of it. Sorry for the rambling, I'm just painting a picture. So I get to my dad's Saturday morning, hang out for about 30 minutes, and decide to ring up my cousin. Mind you, it's summer transitioning to autumn. To which, of course, he's home. I get permission and start my trek. Alone, mind you. I can't remember why I didn't have my bike, but I do remember it not being there. As I start walking, clouds get gray, and it begins to drizzle and sprinkle. I'm not too worried about it because I'm halfway there already, and my clothes shouldn't get soaked due to this. As I pass a relative's home, and before I get to my cousin's, there's this long curve that swings right. Once directly center of this curve, it's nothing but trees and dense brush on both sides with no houses in sight. Again, if center, to your left before the brush thickens, there's a small patch of grass about 3 to 4 feet high. I'm walking and get to this curve, and as I get to the center of the curve, the rain gets a bit heavier. As the rain hits the pavement, I'm tightening my shirt collar around my neck to help keep dry. As I'm doing so, I start hearing rustling in the small patch of grass to my left. Thinking it could just be a deer, I turn left, and then I see it. It was a big, tall, humanoid-like creature. It adds back to me, walking oddly and slowly into the woods. It was about 7 feet tall and approximately 30 feet away from me. I suddenly froze. I just stared at it. It was completely engulfed with hair. Black hair, and down its back on the left and right it had a thin white vertical line running down both sides. Now this is going to sound pretty dumb, but it looked like a 7-foot tall skunk with no tail that was standing on 2 legs. As soon as it got to the wood line, I booked it. I remember running on the center yellow lines of the road to help make my escape more quiet, and the rain probably helped with that as well. As I escaped the curve and it straightened out, I could see my cousin's place, and I didn't stop running until I reached the house. I tried to tell my cousin about it, and my family, but everyone just wrote me off. I mean, I was only 13 and had no proof. Phones that exist nowadays didn't exist during this time, and if they did, we wouldn't have been able to afford them. So, no one believed me. I never walked down that road again. Now that I'm older and moved out of state, about twice a year I go down and visit some family around that very road. And every time I pass that curve, I look to see if I can see it again. Story 2. Hi, my name is Ruben, and I'm from Mumbai, India. So let's start. I first heard about Bigfoot as a kid watching National Geographic. I always knew about the Yetis that reside in the deep Himalayan mountains, and I wondered about if there were any Bigfoot possibly living in India. So, what I'm about to tell you was a shocker for me when I first heard it. My family had a New Year's Day gathering, and all my cousins had come over for lunch. We usually spoke about sports and politics, but that was too boring after a while, so I decided to tell my cousins about unknown creatures like the Loch Ness Monster, the Dogman, etc. And I started off by telling them about Bigfoot and how the legend of Bigfoot runs wild among Americans and many people around the world. I was not prepared for what was going to happen next. My dad and my grandpa overheard the conversation, came to my room, and stood in utter disbelief that I knew about Bigfoot, and I realized, just by looking at their eyes, they knew more about it than I'd ever read or seen. In utter shock, my dad started telling me about a story of his childhood when he was around 12 years old, along with my grandpa, that they had encountered something which completely defied belief. He said that on a cold winter's evening, around 7 o'clock in 1972, my grandpa and my dad were coming back from church, and the road that led to the house had acres of sugarcane farm with tall bushes on either side of the road. They were on a scooter, which could be converted to a bicycle if it ran out of fuel, and this came in handy as they lived in the countryside far away from town. While they were passing by a huge banyan tree, something just ran out of the sugarcane farm on the left and crossed the road. This thing was 20 to 25 feet away. My grandpa described it as a huge, 8 to 9 foot tall, hairy ape-like creature with dark black fur. The creature was on two legs, almost like a gorilla, but one who had learned to walk like a human. The creature crossed the road in an instant and went to the other side of the road, saw my dad and grandpa at that very moment, and my dad let out a scream of fear looking at this hairy creature with massive shoulders and pectorals. This led to the creature running away into the field. The speed at which the creature ran was absolutely shocking. My granddad knew this low-powered bike wouldn't do them any good if the creature decided to pursue. Thankfully, this creature decided to leave them alone and was never seen again. This was the encounter that changed their life and raised their curiosity in the subject. They never spoke of it, out of fear of being ridiculed. When they saw me speak of Bigfoots, they knew that they were not alone, and that many people in the world had experienced what they had seen. My dad even went on to say about a man he knew who had filmed one of these creatures, but never knew what they were called and thought it was some kind of an ape. People in India would generally not know much about cryptids. I saw the truth of the story in my grandpa's eyes, and I've never felt such a strong conviction to tell a story like this. I know this may sound weird, but there are accounts of Bigfoot encounters in deep rural India. I don't know what that thing that my grandpa and my dad saw, but I'm sure that it was not a gorilla just walking on 2 feet. Story 3. I saw a crawler, or whatever it is. I've heard Wendigo, I've heard skinwalker, but it absolutely blew me away that other people have been seeing them too. Whatever they are, we don't know a lot, and I don't think that we can accurately classify them just yet. This happened years ago. I was, I believe, in 7th grade, and I'm now preparing to start college. I was sharing my room with my little brothers, as well as a bunk bed. I had the top bunk. It was summer, and since it got really stuffy in the room, we would install screen windows. I, being a light sleeper, woke up in the middle of the night to hear light rhythmic scratching on the screen and raspy breathing. I rolled onto my stomach and peered over the side of the bed. My pillow was directly across the window, and I saw this exactly. It was a creature that was extremely pale and had long, thin limbs. No clothing and no hair. The face was flat and round, and I couldn't really make out a nose or any visible ears. It had very thin lips. The eyes were sunken. At the time I thought they were glowing, but now I believe that it was just eye shine. It was lightly scratching on the screen and looking around the room. I never got the feeling that it noticed me as I watched it, though. It wasn't trying to get in either. It wasn't feverish. It was just making noise. I watched it in silent fear for, I would guess, a minute, but it probably wasn't even that long. Eventually, I crawled backwards down the ladder and into the living room, where I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch. As for height, it had to have been at least 7 feet tall, because it was hunched over at the window, and the window itself was about 5 feet off the ground. There's also another incident a couple of months later where my family and I went on a camping trip with my Boy Scout troop. One of the kids owned property out in the middle of nowhere. I live in central Illinois, and we set up a camp deep into their forest. I woke up in our big family tent and I heard the light scratching again, long and rhythmic on the nylon. I could see impressions of long fingers being made on the wall. I just lay there quietly until it moved away, and I even heard it repeating its process on other tents in the campsite before it wandered off. I didn't say anything until my dad pulled me aside the next morning and said he heard the same thing, which woke him up. One last detail. Before we went to sleep in our tents, there was a long, haunting scream from the woods. It sounded like a hybrid of a person and some animal being killed and howling one last sound of pain. Everything fell silent, and everyone just kind of stood there. Keep in mind that these were experienced woodsmen, and they hadn't heard anything like that before in their lives. Fox vocalization is extremely canid. Mountain lion sounds are distinctly feline, but this was entirely unnatural